I never thought I'd return to my hometown after leaving under such bitter circumstances. For as long as I can remember, my parents constantly belittled me, calling me the family disappointment. They criticized my career choices, my hobbies, and even my friends, never acknowledging a single achievement I managed to earn. When I turned 18, I cut ties and drove off to start my own life, determined to make it on my own. But Grandpa's 80th birthday invitation arrived last month, and something compelled me to set aside my anger just for him. I planned to slip into town quietly, attend the party, pay my respects, and leave before any drama erupted. But old wounds have a way of reopening as soon as you cross that city limit sign. Memories of my mother's disappointed stares and my father's angry rants resurfaced, tugging at my fragile sense of composure. My heart pounded the entire drive, but I kept reminding myself that Grandpa had always been kind to me. He was the only person who ever showed me genuine warmth in that cold, judgmental household. The venue was a modest banquet hall that Grandpa had rented for the day. I arrived early, hoping to greet him privately and avoid my parents until absolutely necessary. As soon as I stepped inside, I spotted Grandpa standing near the buffet table, smiling at me as if no time had passed. He hugged me, his arms trembling slightly, and whispered that he was glad I'd come. The intensity of that moment reminded me of why I had risked this uncomfortable reunion in the first place. We chatted for a few minutes about my life and how I'd managed to survive in the city. Grandpa asked thoughtful questions, never once implying that I was anything but successful in my own right. He told me he missed me, lamenting that the family had grown so distant since I left. I felt a pang of guilt for not contacting him more often, though I also knew my parents stood in the way. Still, his gentle tone and genuine concern reaffirmed that I had made the right choice to come. Other relatives trickled in, including a few aunts, uncles, and cousins who hadn't seen me since I was a teenager. They approached with polite nods and awkward smiles, unsure if they should acknowledge our family tension or pretend it didn't exist. A few tried to make small talk, asking about my work and where I lived, but nobody dared to mention my parents yet. I answered their questions politely, leaving out the uglier details of my long absence. My focus remained on Grandpa, who was greeting every guest with the same bright smile. Eventually, I spotted my parents walking in, their postures stiff and their expressions wary. My mother wore her usual disapproving frown, and my father scanned the room until his gaze landed on me. For a moment, I froze, unsure whether to greet them or let them come to me. They made no move to approach, choosing instead to sit with some cousins, but I could feel their eyes on me. I tried to ignore the tension clinging to the air, focusing instead on keeping Grandpa happy and comfortable. The event started formally with a few speeches and a slideshow of Grandpa's life. I found myself smiling as I watched photos of him in his younger days, vibrant and full of joy. Despite the conflict between me and my parents, there was a certain warmth in remembering the better parts of my childhood. Grandpa looked so content, clapping at each new slide and laughing at old memories. I felt grateful to be there, even if the rest of the family didn't welcome me with open arms. Once the formalities wrapped up, people started mingling, forming small circles for casual conversation. I managed to avoid my parents for a good half hour, chatting with relatives who showed genuine interest in my life. An older aunt asked me about my job, and when I mentioned my freelance work, she seemed impressed rather than dismissive. That was a pleasant surprise, given how my mother would have scoffed at the idea of me not having a real office job. Maybe not everyone in the family judged me as harshly as I feared. Eventually, my father decided to corner me near the dessert table, where I was trying to snag a piece of cake. He stood there, arms crossed, voice dripping with contempt, as he asked why I bothered showing up. My mother appeared beside him, echoing his hostility, reminding me how I'd disgraced them by leaving. I felt my cheeks burn, but I wasn't a teenager anymore, and I refused to shrink under their scorn. With a steady voice, I told them I came for Grandpa, not for their approval. My mother glanced around, lowering her voice, but the anger in her eyes was unmistakable. She hissed that my presence was embarrassing, that I didn't belong after abandoning them for so many years. I couldn't help but roll my eyes, considering they never once tried to see how I was doing. They only cared about appearances, about the whisper of neighbors who might ask where their black sheep child had gone. Still, the force of their resentment hit me like a punch to the gut. Despite the knot forming in my stomach, I held my ground, refusing to be cowed by their criticisms. My father demanded I leave, insisting that I was ruining Grandpa's party simply by being there. That infuriated me because Grandpa clearly wanted me around and I had every right to celebrate his milestone. I calmly stated that if Grandpa wanted me gone, he'd tell me himself, but until then, I wasn't budging. My mother's lips curled into a sneer and she stormed off, dragging my father behind her. I tried to shake off the encounter, reminding myself that their anger was nothing new, though it still hurt. I took a few deep breaths and returned to the festivities, mingling with relatives and catching up with people I actually liked. Grandpa seemed oblivious to the tension, or maybe he sensed it but chose not to dwell on negativity. Either way, his warmth and happiness were contagious, and I felt a renewed sense of belonging as I spent time with him. For the rest of that evening, I tried to focus on the positive moments, ignoring the shadows my parents cast. After dinner, Grandpa invited me to sit next to him, telling stories about his early life that I had never heard before. He spoke about the challenges he faced, how he overcame them, and the importance of forging one's own path. It felt like a private message, a subtle reminder that I wasn't wrong for leaving a toxic environment. I cherish those words because it was one of the few times someone in the family respected my decisions. I promised him we'd stay in better touch, and his eyes glistened with gratitude. At one point, I glanced across the room to see my parents whispering with an uncle who owned a few properties in town. They threw me pointed looks, and I got the sense they were plotting something to ensure I wouldn't stay long. It struck me as pathetic that they still tried to control where I went or what I did, even now. But I chose to brush it off, sipping my drink and listening to Grandpa recount tales about his military service. I had no idea how far they'd go to make me leave. The party began to wind down and people started hugging Grandpa goodbye, thanking him for a lovely evening. I helped clean up some of the decorations and tidied the tables, not wanting to run off without lending a hand. Grandpa appreciated my help, and I felt good doing something useful for a man who had always been supportive. Meanwhile, my parents lingered near the exit, as if waiting for the chance to corner me again. When the last guests were saying their farewells, they finally stepped forward, determined to have the final word. My father informed me that he'd arranged for the police to be called if I didn't leave immediately. I stared at him, stunned that he would go to such lengths to throw me out of a family gathering. My mother chimed in, spouting nonsense about how my presence was shameful and disruptive. They acted like I was some criminal who had crashed the event rather than a guest invited by Grandpa himself. Rage bubbled in my chest, but I refused to let them see me flinch. Grandpa noticed the confrontation and moved closer, looking confused by the hostility. I quickly explained that my parents wanted me gone, that they felt I didn't belong. Grandpa's face hardened, a rare display of anger, and he told my parents to stand down. He said this was his party, and he wanted me here, making it crystal clear whose side he was on. I'd never seen him speak to them with such stern conviction, and for a moment, they looked genuinely taken aback. My father tried to argue, claiming I was a disgrace who'd turned my back on the family. Grandpa cut him off, stating that he'd never blame me for leaving, given how they treated me. My mother turned red, screaming about respect and tradition, but Grandpa simply shook his head. He declared that respect worked both ways, and I deserved better than the abuse they dished out. Seeing my parents so thoroughly scolded by Grandpa felt surreal, almost like I was dreaming. Eventually, my parents stomped out, furious and defeated, and Grandpa hugged me again before letting me go. He apologized for their behavior, lamenting that they couldn't see past their pride to embrace their only child. I reassured him that it wasn't his fault, and he asked me to stay in town a bit longer. I agreed, mostly because I wanted more time with him, and partially because I knew it would infuriate my parents. The next day, I checked into a modest motel, planning to spend a few extra days reconnecting with Grandpa. Over the following week, I took Grandpa to lunch, drove him to a doctor's appointment, and watched old movies at his place. We laughed together, and he seemed happier than ever, despite the tension with my parents still hovering in the background. I found out that my parents were sulking, bad-mouthing me to extended family, trying to paint me as a manipulative intruder. Some relatives stayed neutral, preferring not to take sides, while others quietly offered me support. Grandpa, though, openly defended me, telling everyone I had changed for the better and deserved a chance. My parents' rage escalated when they realized I wasn't leaving town immediately. They started spreading rumors that I was after Grandpa's money, claiming that I had come back to leech off him. It was absurd, since I was financially stable and had no intentions of seeking any inheritance. But they saw me as a threat, someone who might influence Grandpa's decisions, so they tried to poison everyone's perception of me. When I learned about these lies, I felt a surge of defiance, determined to stand up for myself. I confronted my parents at their home, the same house where I grew up, feeling unloved and unwanted. They opened the door reluctantly, and my father's scowl deepened when he realized I wasn't there to grovel. I calmly stated that I knew about their rumors, demanding they retract those lies and respect Grandpa's wishes. My mother sneered, saying that I had no right to march in and make demands after abandoning them for years. My father added that if I was upset, I should go cry to Grandpa, since I clearly cared more about him. That moment crystallized every ounce of hurt and anger I'd carried since childhood. They genuinely had no remorse, no understanding of the pain they'd caused, and no desire to reconcile beyond controlling me. I decided right then that I would protect Grandpa from their toxic behavior and ensure their manipulations ended. They wanted war, and I realized I had the power to fight back in a way they couldn't anticipate. I might have been the black sheep, but I'd learned a few things living on my own. I discovered that Grandpa had been paying for most of their expenses for years, covering their mortgage and even some debts. They'd apparently sunk themselves into various failed ventures, relying on Grandpa's generosity to stay afloat. He never told me because he was kind-hearted and didn't want to stir up more family drama. But once I found out, I saw a path to justice, a way to make my parents face consequences for their behavior. Grandpa was tired of enabling them, and all he needed was a nudge to finally cut them off. I sat down with Grandpa and gently brought up how my parents depended on him so heavily. At first, he was hesitant to discuss money, but I pressed on, explaining that their reliance had fueled their entitlement. He sighed, admitting that he felt responsible, not wanting to see them struggle, especially for my mother's sake. But I reminded him that they were adults who refused to stand on their own, and they repaid his kindness with cruelty. He listened thoughtfully, nodding as I laid out exactly how they'd tried to ruin me. I told Grandpa he had every right to stop subsidizing their lifestyles, and I suggested he get legal advice. He confessed that he'd already been thinking about updating his will, worried that my parents might contest any decisions. Encouraged by my stance, he decided to meet with a lawyer to restructure his finances and ensure his wishes were respected. He wasn't cutting them out entirely, but he intended to reduce their allowances significantly if they kept up their toxic behavior. I promised to support him through the process, relieving him of any guilt for finally taking a stand. When my parents got wind of Grandpa's plan, they panicked, realizing that their golden goose might slip away. They confronted Grandpa, pleading and making empty promises to treat me better, but it was clearly insincere. My father tried to shift the blame onto me, accusing me of manipulating Grandpa into punishing them. But Grandpa was unmoved, stating that their actions at his birthday party showed their true colors. He refused to back down, and I saw a fire in his eyes that told me he meant every word. I watched from the sidelines as my parents scrambled, each day growing more desperate. They reached out to relatives, asking them to convince Grandpa to change his mind, but most people wanted no part in the feud. The rumor campaign they'd started against me backfired, making them look spiteful and petty in the community. I felt a grim satisfaction seeing them face the fallout of their own hateful behavior. For the first time in my life, I no longer felt powerless against them. About a month later, Grandpa finalized the legal documents, ensuring his assets were protected from any frivolous claims. He didn't disown my parents entirely, but he set strict conditions for any financial support, demanding basic respect and accountability. If they continued to harass me or slander me, they'd forfeit whatever help he offered. My parents, cornered by their financial desperation, began sending me apologetic messages, dripping with false remorse. But I wasn't the naive kid they once bullied, and I saw through their manipulation instantly. I ignored their attempts at forced reconciliation, fully aware that they only wanted to save their cushy arrangement. Their hollow apologies only confirmed that they had no genuine desire to mend our fractured relationship. Grandpa and I remained close, sharing weekly phone calls and occasional visits, maintaining a healthy bond that had eluded us for years. My parents were left with a choice: shape up or lose everything, and I didn't care which path they chose. That was the first time I felt truly free, liberated from their shadow, and ready to live life on my own terms.